Good morning and welcome to Behind the Screen. I'm your host, JM. This is a show where we hang out and we talk about games, board games, role playing games, card games, games that we love, and games that inspire us. And that at their core have a nugget of beauty that we like to tease out and talk about. Because in this increasingly dark and divisive internet, it's good to focus on the beautiful from time to time. Um, it makes me think of why I even started this whole thing was going through Dante. There's this point where Dante is standing before, I think it's the gates of Dis, and these fallen angels are like, sweet, he's not supposed to be here. It's the first time they really encounter fallen angels. Up until then, it's all been mythical monsters. They're like, summon the Medusa and turn him to stone. And Virgil tells Dante to hide his face. It's the one time we see Virgil kind of flustered. And it's because turning to stone is a metaphor for despair. And so this was explained by my good friend Richard in his Dante class, and I've really taken it to heart, this idea of don't look at the Medusa. There are ways we can turn our eyes or fix our eyes on things that are beautiful. And that's kind of what we're talking about. It's weird to be talking about that while talking about Wrath and Glory, because Warhammer 40k is the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. But Cubicle 7 just puts out great books and just amazingly beautiful books. So that's why we're talking about them. And the game design is brilliant. As I said before, no matter what flavor your table likes, there's a choice for that with Cubicle 7's Warhammer game lines. If you want to play the grim and gritty versions of fantasy and sci-fi, you have Warhammer Fantasy and Imperial Maledictum, which I can't wait to review. If you want something a little bit more heroic, you've got Soulbound and Wrath and Glory. So that's what we're talking about. It's interesting to me that both of the heroic games use a D6 die pool, while the grittier games use a D100 system. I think it's because the D100 can be very swingy, and it lends to that every blow could be your last. That's why I chose it for Jackals. Whereas a die pool sort of, you have like it, it averages out the more dice you have. So, but I forgot to say this. Good morning to Mark and Tink and Rook and Grom and Jan Doom. Good to see you all. So today we're talking about Wrath, Glory, and Ruin. The core mechanics of the game is kind of how we're going to walk through and say, here's what the die pool does for you. So if you're unfamiliar with die pool systems, because it's really think there's really only about 5 or 6 actual die pool mechanics or die mechanics used in role-playing games, die pool being one of them. You assemble a pool of dice, you roll all of them, and certain numbers are counted as successes, or in Wrath and Glory, icons. And the way that works is most of these things are attribute plus skill. You get those two numbers put together. That's the total of the d6s you're going to roll. A standard target number is 3, meaning you need at least 3 icons to show up on your dice. Well, 4s and 5s generate 1 icon, 6s generate 2. You equal or exceed the difficulty number, and you succeed at your task. That's the core of almost everything that that Wrath and Glory is built upon. Assemble your die pool, tally up 4s, 5s, and 6s. 6s count as 2 icons. Does that number equal or exceed the target number? The only other interesting mechanic is that for most rolls in the game, most tests, I should say, one of your dice in your die pool needs to be a different color. So you can always pinpoint that. And that's called the Wrath die. And the Wrath die replaces one of the dice in the die pool. It does not get added on top of your die pool. So if your strength is 2 and your melee attack is 2, you get 4 dice. 3 of them are normal. 1 of them is a Wrath die. And again, we're using d6s for this. If the Wrath die comes up a 1 or a 6, something special happens. It still counts as a regular die. 4s and 5s generate 1 icon. 6s generate 2. But if you roll a 6, you get a critical success. And actually, you get something good that happens even if you fail the rest of the roll. If you roll a 1, you get a narrative consequence, even if you succeed at the roll. I talked with Ross about this, and it was one of the things that he liked about the Genesis system was this idea that you could succeed with complication or fail with like a bonus, but he didn't like how often it came up. So this reduces it, 1 die. Now, there are instances where you will roll multiple wrath die. When we get to psychic powers, that's kind of where it happens, and I love it. But that's the core of the game. Die pool, one of them is a wrath die. Roll your dice. 6s or higher, or 4s or higher, count as icons. Now, what do you do if you exceed your target number? Well, this is where it gets a little shifty. If you have any 6s in your die pool that you don't need to exceed the target number, you can shift these 6s, these exalted icons, for effect. And what that means is, say I rolled 5 dice against a target number of 3, and I rolled 3 6s and a 5. So it's a total of 3 exalted icons, each counting as 2, and a 5 which counts as 1. Well, I need at least 3 to succeed, so I take the 5 and the 1 6 and set them aside, and that leaves me with 2 6s. So you can shift them for effect. And this is how you get, in a narrative sense, in a regular test, every 6 you shift for effect means you do the job quicker, better, faster. In combat, every 6 you're able to shift is an extra die of damage that you get to roll. Now, one of those 6s could be shifted for glory. Now we're going to talk about the metacurrency, because Cubicle 7 loves its metacurrency. Warhammer Fantasy has 4 different ones. Resolve, Fate, Fortune, and a 4th one that I never remember. Soulbound, we looked at Soulfire. In 40K, we have Wrath and Glory. They put the name of the game in the mechanics. It's cool. So, everyone starts with 2 Wrath points. You get more when you critical, or if you do something cool, the GM can hand them out. What a Wrath point allows you to do is you can spend 1 Wrath per roll. You can re-roll failures. You can restore all of your shock, which is kind of like your stun. If we're familiar with Torg, it's like your shock. Or you can make a narrative declaration. No, that guard is my cousin. That's the one I always use as an example. So those are what Wrath points do for you. Glory, however, is a group pool. Starts at 0 to a maximum of 6, or the number of PCs you have plus 2, whichever is greater. And the glory gets filled up by people shifting exalted icons from their pool, success pool, into the glory pool. These are pretty powerful. You can increase your die pool before you roll by 1. You can spend glory for extra damage. You can spend glory if you critically hit to inflict the glory effect on a critical hit roll. Or you can seize the initiative. And those last 2 we'll talk a little bit more about when we hit combat. But just briefly, the way combat works is generally a PC gets to go first, and then they select then an NPC gets to go, and back and forth. One side then the other, one side then the other. Feels a little bit like the long turns of the 40K game. One side gets to go, then the other. Well, so back to back can only happen once, but you can spend a glory to say, no, I'm actually going to go next. So 2 PCs can go, and then an NPC has to go. We'll get into that when we get into our combat in November. Man, Grom, I love the 1-roll engine. I haven't thought about Rain or Wild Talents in forever. I love the 1-roll engine. I love Breadth and Height. I think it's a great mechanic for very quickly establishing what I want to do and how I want to do it. Big fan of Grace Stolze's design. Also love his work on Delta Green. Haha. I truly think, what's the name of the adventure for Delta Green? Greg wrote an adventure. So the idea of Delta Green is you're playing this group of government agents whose each of their individual teams have been wiped out by the mythos, and you are all tasked by this agency Delta Green to hunt mythos things. So it's basically like the X-Files meets Cthulhu. So he wrote, it might be called Training Missions. I'll have to put that in the show notes. He wrote an adventure where each adventure is a different branch of the government encountering a new mythos creature, and each one explains only one facet of the game. So as you play through, if you played through all of these training missions with your table, not only is the mortality rate high enough that generally only one or two players or characters are going to survive the mission, so at the end of it you have your group for Delta Green, but also you're learning the system as you play through. So the first one, I believe, is you're on the space shuttle and you're all astronauts, so you don't have any combat. It's really, can you use your skills? Here's the introduction to Delta Green's skills to get through it. I know, a massive digression, but big fan. So we covered Wrath and Glory, and the last one is Ruin. This is going to be a short video because explaining the core rules of Wrath and Glory is pretty easy, and the metacurrency is nice. So Ruin is the GM's sort of solo currency that can replicate a lot of the effects that Wrath and Glory have for the players. Wrath being a personal metacurrency, Glory being a table metacurrency. So as a GM, you start off with a number of Ruin points equal to your number of your PCs. And it allows you to do a lot of things that Wrath and Glory do. You can seize the initiative. You can reroll failures. You can soak a roll for your NPC. And a lot of the really cool NPCs have ruinous powers that cost Ruin points to activate. And there's ways that you get them back as the GM. But that's really the core mechanic of Wrath and Glory. I wanted to keep this to a short video. I mean, granted, I digressed for about 3 minutes there on One Roll Engine and Delta Green. But I wanted to show off that this game has a very simple core mechanic that everything else builds up upon. I'm looking forward to November when we're going to look at how combat works, how psionics works, what enemies look like, how do you run enemies, and then what other books are available for Wrath and Glory right now. But for now, we're taking a step away in October from Wrath and Glory. We are going to be looking at Lost Colony and Maw of Oblivion next week. A cool independent game that was sent to me called Mirror Side. We're also going to be looking at Shadows of Estrin and a couple of other things. I set the schedule to Tink so she could make a sweet those weekly cards for us. And also, and I don't know when this is going to go live, but I have another unboxing that I'm going to be doing with Landauer of Peg, and I've got the box right here, John. What could be in this Studio 2 box? We'll get that set up and set out, and I'll post a link to it on the Iconic Discord. But that's it. That's what we've got. That's Wrath and Glory. Again, Cubicle 7 has done a great job with all three of the games I've read so far. I haven't read the new D100 Warhammer 40k. That's something for later in the future. But that's we're wrapping up our Wrath and Glory look right now. That's it for now. October is going to be horror focused, and I can't wait to get back into Savage Worlds and talk about Lost Colony and Maw of Oblivion. John, thank you for reacting in the only appropriate way. I can tell you that it is possibly Gwyneth Paltrow's head. So, until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. I'm JM, this has been Behind the Screen. I will see you all next week for a look at some Savage Worlds stuff. Until then, have a good one.